Okay, as an introduction about the speaker, Mr. Mohit Satyanand, is an investment analyst as well as the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Liberty Institute, an independent think tank dedicated to empowering the people by harnessing the power of the market.
All right, good morning everyone, and actually good afternoon, and thank you for staying on. So what we've seen, I think in the early part of the discussion today is on China, and now we're going to move on to the next emerging market giant, which is oftentimes seen with a more romantic hue, you know, the Bollywood, yoga, spicy food. But is that all, or is there much more to be heard about India? And without further delay, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Mohit.
Thanks very much for having me here. As you can see, I'm very much a Generation Xer, and it's wonderful to see so many Generation Ys in this room. Yes, India is a very complex place, and people like to talk about yoga. It is a land where every major religion in the world is practiced, and it's the only country in the world where 4 major religions actually originated. Hinduism, after which the old name for India came from. Sikhism, the people with long hair and beards and turbans. Jainism, and Buddhism. But staying with Hinduism, there's a lot more to the Hindu tradition than yoga. We also have a major goddess, which is the goddess Lakshmi. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. And her festival is the biggest festival in India every year. The festival of Diwali, which people know is the festival of fireworks and lights. But it is the day on which wealth is worshipped, in which tokens of gold or silver are placed before her idol. It's the day when gambling is seen as something obligatory. Everyone should gamble. And it's the day when the stock markets of India have a special session, a special auspicious session. So there is a very, very long tradition of worshipping wealth and good fortune in India. It goes a lot beyond yoga. And therefore it's extremely strange that for the first 40 years of Indian independence, we should have been talking about a Hindu rate of growth. At which time, the GDP of this large, talented nation with huge resources was growing at only 3.5% per annum, as though there was something about being Hindu that predestined us, that gave us this fate of growing at only 3.5% per annum. Actually, it should have been called the Fabian rate of growth. Fabian being that particular form of socialism which was adopted by our first Prime Minister, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, as a result of the very privileged socialists, the champagne socialists, with whom he socialized when he was in the UK as a young student. It was partly also thrust on him by the geopolitics of the time, where in a sense, when the young nation was formed by carving the older unified India into India and Pakistan, that Pakistan was aligned with the US, and India was almost forced to align with Russia, and therefore we went into a socialist, planned, top-down model of growth, with an accent on import substitution, with an accent on self-dependence, and with very, very clunky computerized models to decide who should produce what. And the starting mantra of all of this was that that economics is about scarcity. Everything is scarce, and therefore only the people sitting at the top should decide how these resources are to be allocated. And so we had every sector in the country had its output capped by industrial licenses. So you had a ridiculous situation where somebody made scooters, for example. He made 50,000 scooters a year. And if the demand at any point in time was 500,000 scooters, you went on a waiting list and you waited 10 years to get a scooter. This is the India of my youth. This was a system which suited many people. It allowed power to be concentrated in the top. It forced industrialists whether they worked out of Bombay or Pune or Chennai, to come to Delhi to pay their obeisance to those who rule the country. They all had very strong offices over there. And aside from taxes, there were huge facilitation fees that were paid to the people in power. As an economic model, this model could not have lasted. Such models are extremely inflexible. They create huge barriers to growth. They have huge internal inconsistencies, and they crack up. And that's what happened to us in 1991. India, this vibrant land of, at that point in time, 750 million people, came close to bankruptcy. We were in a situation where we had literally 1 week's worth of foreign exchange. And for a country which worshipped Lakshmi and gold, we were in the ignominious situation of having to ship some of India's reserve gold to London as a pledge to make sure that we had money to import steel and petroleum for the next week. This was something that really struck at the heart of Indians. But more importantly, what it did was that it brought the IMF and the World Bank in, and they said, we will extend you emergency credit, however, you have to reform. And that was the situation under which India reformed. The reason I'm underlining this is to say that the impetus for reform in India was not a political impetus. It was something that was imposed by the internal contradictions of an economic model that was not working. And as a result, when you look back at it 20 years later, you realize that what India did was to reform not as much as possible, but as little as possible. Our reform was as little as possible. What we did was that we liberalized the external sector. The Indian rupee became partly convertible, and very importantly, we did away with industrial licensing. What we did not do, which seems really, really strange and has led to huge internal contradictions, which are even more fundamental in nature, is that we did not liberalize internal trade. Trade within the country still has huge barriers, especially trade in agricultural goods, which seems bizarre, but it's very, very real. What we did not do is to legitimize the ownership of property and to make the ownership of property total and to make it a fundamental right. It was there in our constitution. It was removed during an emergency, a political emergency that we had in 75, 77, and it was not brought back. However, that little spark of liberalization that emerged in 1991 changed the face of our country. It changed the face of our country, and it made possible at least one very, very major shift, which was that it was no longer seen as, in a sense, decadent to consume. Huge sections of India were spared the ignominy of having to queue up for a scooter, for a telephone connection, or for a flight. I'm just taking 3 examples, but when I began working in the 80s, if you wanted to suddenly go from Delhi to Bombay, there was only one carrier, which was a nationalized airline, and the only way that you could get a seat at short notice was by ringing up a minister or a member of parliament. A telephone connection took between 5 and 7 years to get. Today, you can walk into any shop and pick up a cellular phone for the equivalent of $20. Calls in India are the cheapest anywhere in the world. We're talking about less than 1 cent a minute. And today, 720 million cell phones are owned in this vast and poor nation. So it opened up things massively. I'm going to cut forward to 2003, 2007, where really what happened was that we saw our growth rates moving up more and more rapidly. In retrospect, it's very clear to everybody that a lot of this ratcheting up of growth came from the great Bernanke credit boom, which was only a continuation of the Greenspan credit boom, and it flooded across the world. It certainly flooded into India. And what it did was that this nation, which is a very capital-short nation, as all young, growing nations should be, where interest rates were typically very substantial, both in nominal and in real terms, where inflation has averaged 7 to 8% per annum, we had interest rates which were in the region of 13 to 15%. And we grew used to it. In 2003, when I came back from a long sabbatical from the commercial world, and I started catching up with economic fundamentals, I was shocked to see that the 10-year bond rate in India was down to 5.5%. And I said, we are going to see an economic boom, the likes of which we have never seen before. True enough, between 2003 and 2007, our stock market index, the Nifty, went from 1,000 to 6,300. It was a bull run like you've never seen before. And we saw the economy growing at 9 to 10% per annum. And somebody said, and then it became a mantra accepted by everybody, that the Hindu rate of growth has gone forever, and India can now grow at 9 to 10% per annum. Like all other countries, when the bust of 2008 came, our response to it was fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. Reduce taxes and take down the interest rate, open the spigots of bank finance. It worked for a while. And what we are hearing, I see huge similarities between what's happening in China and what's happening in India. When money is much cheaper than the economy has been used to, when real interest rates are negative, you end up with massive structural changes in the economy. You have structural problems which take a long time to do away with. And if you haven't changed the basic functioning, the basic skeleton of your country, at some point in time, you're going to have to come to deal with them again. One Firdaus asked me just before I came up onto stage whether I was going to be as negative about India as our two Western friends were about China. As an economist, it's very difficult not to be. As a humanist and somebody who looks at India from the political sphere, it's actually very easy to be positive about India. So let me just contrast these two. I won't spend too long because I think the real meat of this session is in the questions that are asked. So I'll try and finish what I have to say in the next 5 or 7 minutes. First, about the economy. Given the way the Indian economy and Indian governance is structured today, India is incapable of growing at 10, 9, 8, or perhaps even 7% per annum. We need radical reform for that to happen. And this radical reform has got to come in the area of public finances, but more importantly, rather than just looking at the fiscal deficit, which is alarming. So let me just spend a minute on the fiscal deficit. In 2003, 2004, wishing to say goodbye to all our sins of the past, the Indian government legislated a fiscal responsibility bill, which said that we must keep our fiscal deficit below 3%, and we must move towards a situation where the fiscal deficit, which means the gap between the government's spending and the government's revenue, is less than 3% of GDP. It must move down to 1%. 2003, 2007, when the economy was growing at 9, 10% a year, was the best possible time to do it. We didn't do it. We didn't heed the biblical advice of putting money by in the good times. The populist governments spent, and they continue to spend. In 2008, when the backlash of the boom hit us, it was too late to talk about fiscal responsibility. There was a need for fiscal stimulus. And so we had the fiscal stimulus. Today, we're talking about fiscal deficit by the federal government, which is estimated at somewhere in the region of 5.5%. Our states are running deficits somewhere in the region of 3.5%. And then we have deficits which are off the balance sheet, but which basically come on account of publicly owned companies, such as our oil marketing companies, the fertilizer companies, and the power companies, which run to something of the order of between 2 and 2.5%. Overall, we're talking about a fiscal deficit of something like 10.5 to 11%. Accounting in India public sector accounting in India is horrible. We won't know until 2 years down the line what exactly it was. So let's stay with that figure. But there is a real figure which tells you how are people looking at the fiscal deficit, and that is the bond market. The bond market says you're doing a good job of managing the country's economics or you're not. And when the whole world is alarmed, the Financial Times has screaming headlines saying that the deficit in Italy is not manageable because bond yields in Italy have crossed 6%. In India, bond yields 2 weeks ago, the 10-year bond yield reached 9%. At which point in time, the Reserve Bank India had to step in and buy bonds from the banks so that the banks could go out and buy bonds from the government. So the fiscal situation is really, really horrible. But what alarms me much more are the governance deficits in India, and the governance deficits are huge. I will briefly comment on 3 of them. The first is the power deficit. Our politicians have no deficit of power, they have huge amounts of power, but our industry and our citizenry have a huge deficit of power. We talk of an energy shortage of the extent of something like 8 or 9%. To my mind, the figure is irrelevant. Because when you know that you are living in an energy-short country, you're not going to set up energy-intensive industries, and therefore what the real power deficit is unimportant. But the really alarming figure over here is that 52% of homes in India do not have electricity. They have no electric connection into their home. And when I sit at home and see my 13-year-old son going to a privately run school, plugged into his iPod, his iPad, and doing his homework assignments on the school intranet, I think of those children who are going home after walking 2 hours from the nearest school and do not have access to power. And I wonder how many generations it's going to take for them to have the same kind of access to education and therefore to the modern world as my son. And this makes me really, really sad. And the reason for this is, as the reason for most problems in the world, is bad policy. And the bad policy is cheap power. You have cheap power. As a result, the state electricity boards are broke. The state electricity boards are broke, so no power producer wants to sign a purchasing power agreement with him. And so you have this chronic shortage of power. And nobody wants to stand up to the reality and face the voters and say, we have to take the price of power up by 25%. And the deficits of the power sector are just ballooning. Everybody, including Datuk Rohana, talked about Indian education, talked about the Indian Institutes of Technology. It's nice that people like to talk well about India. The reality is actually quite grim. Only one of these IITs is considered among one of the world's top 500 universities. That's a pretty dismal record. Only one out of the 500. Korea has more. Korea has 6. China has 17. We've made a hash of higher education. But even more importantly, we've made a hash of primary education. We have 100% enrollment in primary education. That's fantastic. That's a long way from the 50% it was when I went to primary school. But the dropout rates are alarming. There are only 50% schools in our country where, on a given day, 75% or more children are in attendance. only 50%. Means in 50% of our schools, less than 3/4 of the number of children who are going to school, who are enrolled in that school, are actually attending it. It's a chicken and egg situation. They're not learning enough. Learning outcomes are disastrous, and they're not improving. They're going down. In two of the largest states in our country, which are Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, less than 50% of children in grade 5 can subtract. Grade 5. This is a country which worships learning. And roughly the same number of grade 5 children can read a grade 2 text. We have a right to education bill which was promulgated with great fanfare 2 years ago. But what was its most significant feature? Its most significant feature was to put a blanket requirement on all private schools in the country to reserve 25% of their seats for poor children. It did nothing to address the problems of the 75% of children who are going to government schools. Where on a given day, if you walk into a government school, these are surveys of 100,000 schools done by an NGO working with volunteers from all over the country, a massive survey. They found that at any given point of time, if you walked into a government school, only 60% of the classes were experiencing teaching. The teachers were either absent completely, or they'd been deputed to some other government duty, or they were sitting under a tree and knitting. This is not an exaggeration. This is the reality. Our government does not govern. That's the grim side. What's the positive side? I'd like to dwell on two things. One, as an economist, on the financial and the fiscal, which is that today we are reaching, I think, a second crisis point after 91. Whether that crisis happens in 2011, extremely unlikely, since we only have a few more days, or in 2012, I don't know. But we are reaching a fiscal breaking point. In the last 6 weeks, we've seen the rupee depreciate by 20%. That's an enormous number. And for a country which imports 70% of its petroleum, 30% of its coal, despite having the second largest coal reserves in the country, but because coal is a state-owned monopoly, imports 50% of its edible oil, a lot of it from your country, palm oil from Malaysia and from Indonesia. A depreciation in the currency of 20% is flowing straight through to inflation. It's flowing straight through to the back pocket of the common man. This is a disaster. At the same time, because of the structural inefficiencies created by the credit boom and the overlending in the period 2003-2007, we have exactly the same problems. The non-performing loans of the banks, the lack of transparency of the bank balance sheets, especially those that are owned by the state. We also have a debt crisis emerging. Now, when you put these two together, where the second credit boom has not worked, where growth is slowing on the one side and inflation on the other side, you have a central bank which is caught in a complete quandary. Does it improve liquidity, which is required in order for growth to go up again, or does it counter inflation? And the policy room has reduced significantly. So where you talked about the possibility of stagflation in China, it's not a possibility in India any longer. It's a reality that we're going to have to deal with in the next few months. This is a crisis in the making. And as somebody who looks at political economy, I think crises are wonderful if you know what use to make of them. And this now brings me to the positive side of India, the fact that it is a democracy, an extremely vibrant democracy, where protest is a part of the way in which we deal with our nation, and where it is completely impossible for the nation's leaders to put down protest. And I'll just talk about 3 significant developments in the last year. The first is the protests about land. As I said, the right to ownership of land, the right to property, is an extremely constrained right in India. And as with many nations, including the US, we have this right of eminent domain, which is the right of the state to go out and buy land and use it for public purpose. Public purpose was very poorly defined, and as happens in any country where you have a huge concentration of power with the political class, in India, that public purpose included car manufacturing and included homes for the wealthy in the suburbs of Delhi. This became intolerable at some point in time. It led to widespread protests. It led, most importantly, to the falling of a state government. The government of the state of West Bengal in the east of India fell because of protests about the way in which land acquisition was handled. More recently, in the outskirts of Delhi, which is a booming megalopolis, something like 25 million people, the farmers realized that their land, which had been taken over supposedly for public purpose, was basically now being used to set up luxury apartments. And they protested. The nature of public protest in India, because it is united with a very, very free press, is such that this was a hot potato for the government to handle, for the local government to handle. And they had to go back and renegotiate the deals with the farmers. The deals were renegotiated, the farmers were given much better terms, but most importantly what it did was that it led to the drafting of a completely new bill which was not part of the agenda for that session of Parliament as to how to deal with real estate. It was an extremely clever bill, and it looked at setting up a regulatory body to determine the situation under which real estate should be developed. Simultaneously, a second bill was drafted to look at land acquisition, and what this did was make much tighter definitions of what public purpose is, and say that if it is not for public purpose, at least 80% of the land, even if it is for public purpose, at least 80% of the land must be acquired by voluntary interaction between the landholders and the agency. The balance 20%, the state may have to step in and get into acquisition. Those of Google and Facebook, asking them to pre-censor messages on these two social media, ostensibly to reduce the possibility of any